This is Myth 10, and my voice is a little strained from laryngitis, and so I will try to keep this timbre to my diction, and hopefully, if your ears are tuned to my adolescent voice, you'll be able to hear in the croaking something hopefully delivered which is of interest and of value to you. In ancient times, declamation was such an art that orators would put 2 small pebbles in their mouth and train themselves speaking against the surge of waves at the seashore in order to develop the dexterity of pronunciation and the wonderful amperage of projecting the voice. In the 1960s, in San Francisco, all of this was looked upon with scorn. And long, embarrassed, and then finally unembarrassed silences dominated the educational institutions. And great seminars were seminars in which very few words were ever spoken. And the gestures were all as indicating that there were further revelations of something unsaid. And those kinds of seminars would begin with what were called at that time texts without comment. And little quotations were introduced. And then long silences were allowed to let you mature whatever you could make out of the sequence and combinations of these texts without comments. This is antithetical, anti-myth techniques of discussion. They're based and developed upon 1960s understanding of philosophers like Ludwig Wittgenstein, who, in a very famous quotation, one time said, "Whereupon a man cannot speak, therefore must he remain silent." And in the 60s, everyone realized that anything that you said had implications that were infinite, and it was only a matter of intellectual courtesy, if not conscious acuity, to let those infinite reverberations have a place to trail off into the dimensions of the unknown. I have 3 quotations for you in a sequence. The first is from Mircea Eliade, and the third is from Ernst Cassirer, the 2 books which form the pair of texts that we're dealing with now, Language and Myth and Myth and Reality. And in between them, I have positioned a quotation from August Strindberg, from his diary written in Paris called Inferno, when he assumed that he was going insane and kept a very detailed, interested notebook on the process. The first quotation is from Mircea Eliade from 1946. And these 3 quotations together constitute an insight into the primordial nature of mythology. Eliade wrote in his journal, "I don't believe I'm the only one who can transcend repeated failures and melancholic, hopeless sufferings when, by an effort of lucidity and willpower, I understand what they represent in the immediate, concrete sense of the word, a descensus ad infernum, a descent into the inferno. Once you wake up realizing that you are wandering in an inferno, in an infernal labyrinth, you feel anew, tenfold, those spiritual powers you considered long since lost. In that moment, any suffering becomes an initiatory ordeal. no comment. Juxtapose Eliade's quotation with that of August Strindberg. I repeat, I was never haunted by visions, but real objects did often appear to me as being endowed with human shapes, often producing effects of startling grandeur. My pillow, for example, pushed out of shape during my afternoon nap, presented me with marble heads sculptured in the style of Michelangelo. One evening, returning to my room with the American faith healer's double, I perceived, in the half shadow of the bed alcove, a gigantic Zeus reclining on my bed. Faced with this unexpected sight, my comrade stood motionless in the grip of an almost religious terror. Third quotation from Ernst Cassirer. I don't have a portrait of him here. He had long, white, wavy hair, distinguished, long, Teutonic features, and an ironclad gaze that would unwaveringly cinch his language. The same function which the image of the god performs, the same tendency to permanent existence, may be ascribed to the uttered sounds of language. The word, like a god or a demon, confronts man not as a creation of his own, but as something existent and significant in its own right, as an objective reality. As soon as the spark is jumped across, as soon as the tension and emotion of the moment has found its discharge in the word or the mythic image, a sort of turning point has occurred in human mentality. The inner excitement, which was a mere subjective state, has vanished and has been resolved into the objective form of myth or of speech. And now an ever-progressive objectification can begin. This is from page 36 of Language and Myth. We need now to do some emendations and begin to pull from these three quotations, which you can consult later on, listening to this tape, and bring this entire lecture out of the sequence of these three. Let's amend Cassirer first, with your permission. When he says, when he writes, that this emotional tension discharges itself into the word or the mythic image, he means one or the other. And though words and mythic images, though myth and language have a common source, a common root, the bifurcation has happened so that the two work together as parallels. The myth as a story is carried by the mythic image, and the word as the carrier of the language carries a structure, the pure structure of which is logic, so that the word has a structural capacity as logos and makes a logic, and that logic tends to negate the myth, the mythic quality of language, so that logic and myth, while they're parallel, They're also polar in Caesar's thought, so that the more one emphasizes logic, the less emphasis there is in myth. The more myth sweeps us along, the less logic there is. So that it's an either-or. It's a polarity. But let's for a moment pull out three emendations to Caesar. First of all, when he writes word or the mythic image, a sort of turning point has occurred in human mentality. We should amend this, that this, at this juncture, is feeling and not thought. That the turning point that occurs here is not on the level of symbol, but is on the level of myth. And that one should not make a confusion of thought with myth, of symbol with myth, of thought with feeling, though they're intimately connected. And in fact, the existence of thought cannot occur without the prior context of feeling. One of the great translators, in fact, the woman who did the introduction to this English translation of Language and Myth, the woman who did the translation and the introduction, Suzanne K. Langer, whose work on philosophy of symbolic forms we will use later on. She wrote once that mind is so intimately connected with feeling, but that feeling is primordial, it comes first, and that thought is actually an elaboration of feeling. She, towards the end of her writing career, wrote a 3-volume philosophic history of the mind, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Its title, in all 3 volumes, Mind, an Essay on Feeling. So that the intelligence of feeling is a mentality. And in the mythic section of our education, we deal with the mentality, with the acuity and extension of the way in which feeling is intelligible. The matrix within which feeling occurs in its intelligibility is experience. And thought is an outgrowth of experience. It is an outgrowth of experience in a misnomered way, for actually thought is an ingrowth of experience. Thought is an interiorization of experience, so that symbols are an inner quality of resonance of the language which is there as a membrane on the surface. Now, this is very difficult to imagine without a diagram. So think to yourself of a world. And this world has a surface, and the surface topography of this world is the experience realm which we have and which is keyed by feeling. So that feeling is the intelligent navigator and also cartographer of the whole world. The interiorization of this world of feeling is the inner world of thought. It's the world of the mind. It's the inner quality of our attentiveness. But the world, with its inner quality, it also has an atmosphere around it. It has a context. And that atmosphere, that context, is the ritual comportment. It is the action, the activity. The ancient name for that activity, for that action in Greek was pragmatos, so that one speaks of something pragmatic. It's the ultimate basis of fact is the pragmatic occurrence of something. An Aristotelian form, which is the formal shape of the fact in ancient Greece, is all based upon physis, upon the emergent quality of its existence. So that the ritual comportment is the weather which surrounds the topography of feeling. And the topography of feeling, when internalized, becomes the realm of ideas. The realm of thought becomes the mind. Now, in this whole ecology, there's a quality here of insight which is necessary, which our three quotations direct us to. Let's take the middle quotation for a second. The quotation from August Strindberg. Let's refresh ourselves again. Strindberg is in Paris in the 1890s. He is concerned with his mental health. He is a genius of language and insight. For instance, Strindberg knew Chinese well enough to catalog the Swedish Imperial Library collection of Chinese books. He was the first Scandinavian playwright to have a play produced in Paris, which he was extremely proud of. He lived in Berlin for quite a long time and spoke very fluent German. So Strindberg was quite an intellectual fellow, very cultivated. But in his Inferno, in his journal of keeping track of his own mental decay, he was accurate enough to see that he did not see visions, but he saw in the contours of physical shapes, of ritual shapes, of existent things, qualities of shape which gave him later on the experience of mythological figures. The seeing of Zeus in the half-shadowed alcove of his bed as he enters the room. But not only does Strindberg see it, but the friend who's with Strindberg also sees it. So that there's a contagion. One does not have a private projection, but on the level of what Strindberg is presenting, what you project, others can see also. It's not a mass psychosis. It's not a mass hypnosis. It's a very strong individual whose psychic energy in the experiential realm gives the contours to the topography of the world. Whatever is able to be languaged, that language styles what is. So the existent things lend themselves to the contouring of the language. The language impresses the physically existent world with its swirl of shapes, so that we experience the shapedness out of the swirl, and not the extant things pure and abstractly. It takes a very great concentration to demagnetize experience so that one can simply see the rock as the rock, the pillow as the pillow. The bed alcove in Strindberg's Paris garret as simply a bed alcove, and not to see Zeus reclining on his bed, or Michelangelo shapes in the pillow, or who knows what kinds of figures and insights in the rock. Now, Strindberg's insight later on influenced a whole development of 20th century art called Surrealism. Surrealism owes itself to Baudelaire and to Strindberg. Max Ernst, who as an ill young man laying feverishly in his bed, saw in the knots of the wood in his bedroom demonic shapes that haunted him all of his life. And he sought to bring them out, and by giving them form in his art, to exorcise the control that they had over him, to bring out a juxtaposition of something which is natural with something which is supernatural. And that this juxtaposition is the surreality, the below the real and yet above the natural. Some kind of a magic horizon, some kind of a visionary level, a visionary process that exceeds the world but is still somehow under the real, below the real. The real is not yet fully envisioned, but the natural is no longer what it was, and so it's surreal. It's in between. It's a juxtaposition. If we look at this mental diagram of feeling giving us the topography of a world, and the interiorization of that world being the realm of the mind, of symbols, of thought. Thought is an inner world. Feeling is the topography of the world. And the ritual comportment is the atmosphere, the climate, the weather, surrounding and giving context to that world. Nature is the universe in which that world, with its atmosphere, with its topography, with its interiority. Nature is the universe in which that world and all other worlds would have their being, would have their existence, would have their ecology of development. But the vision level is transcendent to this entire ecology. Nowhere, and Strindberg is quite exact, just as Eliade and Casseur are quite exact. When attention is alert in the actual moment, in the temporal present moment of observing the play of this ecology, nowhere in this does vision occur. When vision occurs, it takes one completely out of this realm. Not only out of your mind, but also out of your feelings, out of the realm of the extant, and out of the universe. So that there is another world, an other world, sometimes called a different dimension, sometimes called a transcendent quality. Eliade's great work early on in his life was to inquire, to bring a pair of techniques, one a technique of ecstasis and the other a technique of what he termed enstasis, E-N. Enstasis goes within, ecstasis, like ecstatic, goes without. The shaman was an ecstatic technician of the sacred. The yogi was an instatic technician of the sacred. And so when one finds Eliade, say 40 years ago, contributing to the great Petram Sorokin's book, Forms and Techniques of Altruistic and Spiritual Growth. Alone among the contributors, Mircea Eliade has two contributions. One, a short little précis of yoga, and following it, a short little précis on shamanism. His books on shamanism and on yoga form a pair. They go together. One, the techniques of ecstatic movement away from the whole natural ecology. The other, an instatic concentration of the essence of the realm of nature. The yogi follows a path which is so indelible that when it is seen accurately, it discloses its actual structure. And one of the qualities of its structure is the unerring ability to an accurate observer to predict the next developments regardless of time, regardless of scales of time, to accurately foresee and to predict what the next movements will be. As we said, the ancient Greek term for ritual action was pragmatos, but the ancient Indic word for it was karma. Karma. Ritual is karma. And the yogi follows the way in which karma must unfold. Karma has no particular choice. It has no freedom of choice. It has no multiplicity of dimensions. The multiplicity, the bewildering Sartian freedom that makes of a modern existentialism a nightmare of too much possibility undercut by an absurdity. So the modern existentialist, the existentialiste of the Don Miguel de Unamuno, the existentialism of Sartre, or even the existence of someone like Heidegger, all of these qualities of thought come together in ancient Indic experience as the yogi who seeks to understand that karma must follow its path. In fact, not even a path, one could call it a rut. It is a ritual rut that will follow its development and its own form unerringly, so that one could, with a yogic concentration, reach the point, the single point, called in Sanskrit ekagrata, single-pointedness. This single point is like the point of a stylus, of a pencil, of a pen, the cursor on the screen. That single-pointedness is collected and enfolded in yoga by a quality of enfolding breath and the attentiveness that follows from the existence of the activity of breathing. When breath, as one of the most fundamental qualities of living organisms, is retained, but retained methodically, relentlessly, so that its cycle of natural occurrence, in and out, is brought into not only a perfect equanimity, so that the in-breathing and the outbreathing, the exhale and the inhale are exactly equal. One can also equalize the moment of equilibrium. For just as one finishes breathing in and a split second before one breathes out, there is a pressure equilibrium, there is a pause. That inner pause between the inhale and the exhale can be expanded. And that point out of time, that point of quiet, the eye of the hurricane of the necessity of breathing, can be positioned in such a way that the ekagrata of the yogi bullseyes that dimension. So that the attentiveness of a yogi bullseyeing the equanimity of the ritual of breathing in its exact center develops what later on was called tapas. Tapas collects an energy reservoir so that the breathing cycle now has been tamed at the very height of Neolithic excellence, for yoga as a Neolithic technique. Shamanism is a Paleolithic technique. In shamanism, one follows the game. What is the game? The game is the soul shape. One follows the soul shape, whether it goes into the underworld or the overworld, or the beyond realm. One is able to see the soul's shape in this world, in the underworld, in the overworld, in the beyond world, all four. So the Paleolithic technique of medicine, of healing, of curing, was always to be able to follow the game all the way through its natural ecology of nourishment, its whole life cycle, so that one would know where to find the game this time of year. In this part of the cycle, where is the soul? And to be able to juxtapose one's position with that soul, to catch that soul, to nab that soul, to hunt that soul, and to bring that soul back into this particular body at this particular presence. The Paleolithic presence was a Paleolithic ekagrata that was not in the mind but was in the body. So that the present point in the body for Paleolithic shamanic techniques was always a center which physiologically was identified with the heart. So that the heart, as the center of that body, is also the fount out of which feeling flows. One feels with the heart. One doesn't feel with the mind. One feels with the heart. One touches with the hand, but one feels what one touches with the heart. That the heart is that ekagrata of the body, that heart point, that anahata chakra, quite distinct and quite different from that Saharastra chakra, though the two are parallel. The yogi seeks to bring the Saharastra chakra into focus. The shaman seeks to bring the Anahata chakra into focus, into single focus. Where the yogi looks at the way in which breath equalizes, inhaling and exhaling, equalize, and the presence of the pause is expanded so that it becomes equal, so that you breathe in and you hold it and then you breathe out with three equal qualities, three equal segments, three equal durations. But as soon as one has breathed out, there's another opportunity for another presence of the pause. And one can equalize the center of breathing so that after you breathe in, you pause 1 unit, then you breathe out and you pause 1 unit. Then you breathe 1 unit in and you pause 1 unit. You breathe 1 unit out and you pause 1 unit. Then you have a quaternary. Then you not only have an evenness of breath, but you have an evenness of presence. And that axis of presence then serves as an alternate trajectory of the energy of life. Whereas breath sustains life, that presence axis sustains spirit. And so spirit and life become hair-crossed together, become coordinated together. Together then, if one would do a symbol of the two together, one would have a mandala, one would have a circularity, an ecology that has a four-part quality to it. This has, for the shaman, the heart at the center, and for the yogi it has the mind at the center. What the shaman does with this is use ritual as the basis for the square of attention, so that the shamanic square of attention has ritual as its basis. It rises on myth, it caps itself with symbol, and it completes itself with magical vision. But the yogi begins with symbol. His objective basis is not with ritual, but with symbol. It's a ratchet up. And as he begins with symbol, he rises on vision. He caps it with the person, the Purusha, the vision of the cosmic person, and caps that then with history. So that yoga has a relationship to history similar to the way in which shamanism has a relationship to magic. Shamanism on its tiptoes reaches into the magic realm, but yoga on its tiptoes reaches into the realm of history, which is why Mircea Eliade's great book, The Myth of the Eternal Return, has the second half about history, the misfortune of history, the terror of history. For it is history is one of the biggest obstacles to man's wholeness. Something so large that the shaman never sees, never confronts, never comes into the arena where it's there, whereas the yogi, after long practice, begins to understand that this is very formidable indeed. Let's come back to Eliade for just a moment while the sirens go by, punctuating the lecture. Here in the 1954 volume, edited by the great Petrum Sorokin, one of the founders of sociology, a man born in Leningrad, who, with the Bolshevik Revolution, had to flee with his mother across the ice of Lake Ladoga to get into Finland, finally made his way to Europe, and finally ended up at Harvard and became the head of the Department of Sociology for many long years. Sorokin, whose great book, The Crisis of Our Age, was a truncation of a great 4-volume outline of the way in which future history would unclose its structural capacity. And at the end of The Crisis of Our Age, Sorokin had a timetable of the dismemberment of Western civilization. And we have been following that timetable as if we were on a Czech train schedule, right on time. And the last notation on Sorokin's decay and decline of Western civilization is that great art appears as decoration on commercial vehicles. His choice was Rembrandt paintings on beer cans. And that when they appear, one can tell the sociological timetable is that that whole era of meaning is over. For the confusion, the chaos is then complete. And one needs to get used to the ancient idea that a chaos is a previous order mixed up. When an order atrophies, that's when you have a chaos. It's the implosion after the universe of the Big Bang, before the next Big Bang. That one of the concerns of Eliade is this cyclicity of time, and that myth is linked to sustaining the cyclicity of time as long as it can. And the cyclicity of time is this circular shape of acceptance. What does the circular shape of myth, of a mythology, accept? It accepts the presence of the eternal archetypes, of the eternal in archetypal form. For the eternal has no particular form, except in a time-bound way, the circle of temporality, the cycle of the ritual year, can only accept the gods at their center. And so it's like an ancient technique. You cannot hunt God. You cannot hunt the gods. But you can invite them into a location of your choosing by making the circle of the mythology focus in a particular place. That is where the God will come. By making the circle of language enfold and embrace the entirety of the life of the people, their completeness is where God will come. The ancient Mosaic mysticism was always based upon this understanding. No man has seen the face of God, but the pure community can receive the presence of God, and by his presence you will know his face. So the purity of the community is the only way in which the presence of God is discernible, which is why all the Mosaic laws of purity for the community. Which is why there is in the Moses technique a very definite kind of shamanic technique available. Moses is not a yogi, but he's a shaman. He is someone for whom the search, the hunt for God, showed him that only by making a completed circle of the mythology is there a chance for that presence to be visited, to be inhabited by the divine power, by Yahweh. But look here, as soon as one makes a circle of mythology, one has created a world of feeling, a world of experience. The center of that circle is the interiority of that world, so that it is the mind space where the God manifests. It is the inner realm, which is the point at which the divine focuses, so that divine visits come in that quality. We're going to take a break, but let's listen for a second to Ernst Cassirer in his Language and Myth, the first section entitled In the Pattern of Human Culture. This is his concluding sentence of one of the first pages. As Wilhelm von Humboldt has said in connection with the language problem, man lives with his objects chiefly. In fact, since his feeling and acting depends on his perceptions, one may say exclusively, as language spins language out of his own being, he ensnares himself in it. Each language draws a circle from which there is no escape save by stepping out of it into another. So that the circle, the cycle of language, is so complete because its shape and its content are the activity, the karma, the pragmatos, which we ourselves are doing, and the feeling, experience, intelligence that rises out of this naturally. All of this happens before a single thought is ever made. All of this before there is a single interior realization. Is it little wonder that when thought begins, the very first thought, the very first step of thought, in Buddhism it's called bodhicitta. the beginning, the first seed of thought, is experienced, actually experienced, because experience is already vastly intelligent before that occurs. What does experience? Experience, at the first moment of thought, it experiences something called rebirth, another birth. It experiences birth. So that inner birth, spiritual birth, is the seed of the mind. Spirit birth, by being the way in which the mind then is born and grows and has its place, becomes almost like another figure of oneself. It becomes the inner figure of oneself. But look here, it tends to want to grow in exactly the shape that the mythological imagery had stylized feeling in the first place. That's the road, that's the rut, that's the karma, that's the pragmatos that's there. It takes an enormous education to be able to wake up mid-story and realize that you are in a story. When you do so, the entire timbre of the composition changes. Let's have the Eliade quotation one more time and then take our break. This is from his journal, 1946. I don't believe I'm the only one who can transcend repeated failures and melancholic, hopeless sufferings when, by an effort of lucidity and willpower, I understand that they represent, in the immediate concrete sense of the word, a descent towards an inferno. Once you wake up realizing that you are wandering in an infernal labyrinth, you then feel anew, tenfold, those spiritual powers you considered long since lost. In that moment, any suffering becomes then an initiatory ordeal. Instead of the suffering being the indelible context to which you are condemned, it immediately becomes an initiatory phase out of which transformation will carry you. One of the problems with myth, when it's still connected to ritual, is that suffering is infinite. There's no hope, there's no cure, there's only endurance. For there's no perception of transformation being possible. For transformation requires an awareness that one is in a phase of a process that has more than one phase, has several phases. As soon as that understanding, as that realization comes, one is already on the way to transformation. The thought seed is already there. The waking up was an impregnation, was the way in which that birth was initiated. Suffering then becomes purposeful. One endures a pregnancy towards a new phase rather than a condemnation towards death. So the whole quality of spiritual rebirth is that one is looking towards a future new phase instead of being trapped in a terminal end phase. The shaman with his instasis gets a glimpse of this in a magical projective way, but the yogi experiences this in a telling, conscious, carrying wave. Ecstasis can take us to a magical process, but only an enstasis can carry us through that into that objective quality called the spiritual person. In the Bhagavad Gita called the Purusha, the golden person, who we really are, But that golden person is not our natural body. It's not even our natural mind. It's our differential conscious shape. And it's that shape that is at home in the cosmos, outside of any world, outside of all worlds. In the context in which worlds are made and reborn more than the sands of the Ganges. Let's take a break. Let's come back to Ernst Cassura's quotation about language being a circle which we make, and the tenacity of this circle of myth that we make has its traction in the very way in which karma happens. If you recall, during the ritual section, we talked about how in the Satipatthana Sutra of the Buddha, the attentiveness to what one was doing had an inside focus. And that focus was to do what you do. If you do an action, you are caught up in that action. But if you add an amperage to that activity, so that you put an intention, you do the doing. The doing carries the action, but the doing of the doing carries the intent. So that in Paleolithic times already, there was this quality of adding an arrow to the range of your reach. And the world, instead of just being what you could touch with your hands, became extended to what you could touch with your arrow. The added oomph of your intent, that not only are you doing these actions, but you're doing the doing of these actions. You went inside the actions, which gave the first outlines to the mind. One of the very most beautiful ways of saying this was in his BBC production of The Ascent of Man. Jacob Bronowski used a phrase. He said, "The hand is the cutting edge of the mind." What the hand does. And we saw that in anthropology, the development of the hand goes in step with the development of the eye, so that hand and eye coordination develop the brain. The entire ensemble is a short form karmic way of indicating the shaped patterns, the ecology, the eternal return, which language will inhabit and cinch and seal. And the intensity of language cauterizes the seal so that one is safe inside that form. A mythology seals a people in the ritual year of their activity in the nature of the place, so that one becomes cinched and sealed in a location. The land becomes the very plane upon which this circle, this cycle, is inscribed. And the inscription is our karmic activities, which are repeated again and again. So that repetition, Eliade makes a great deal out of repetition. And in this repetition, there's the reciprocity, if you recall. And there gets to be a rhythm and a pattern in this rhythm. And this pattern is the alternation of the reciprocity within the repetition. And all of this adds a dimension then, so that the karma, the ritual comportment, existence itself has an indelible tone. And if we looked at it with a retrospective yogic eye, we would see very curious quality. Nature is a process. Ritual is a doing, language is a process, everything is in motion. The only quietness is in the mind. The only place where a center could occur is in the space of the mind. There's no center in nature. There's no center in existence. There's no center in language. There is a center when we add intentionality to the objectivization of thought. And we'll see symbols become very powerful. Ideas become very powerful. Thought forms. They get resonances. And one of the qualities that they have is they add a center. Not only a center, but when one has a center, one adds a pivot. And the pivot, any place along its axis of effectiveness, is a turning point. And if one is in command of the entire axis, one has an infinite array of turning points available so that one can, in a yogic way, choose ahead on which plane, on which horizon, which subplane, which sub-horizon, mini-plane, mini-horizon, that one is going to allow for the confirmation of karma to occur. That yes, it must occur, but one has a choice now. It's going to occur in this way. So that the inner presence of symbols becomes so powerful, one can index one's action, and the link together is through the mythological horizon, through the realm of language, through the realm of experience, through the horizon of feeling. And as one pulls feeling into a shapedness, as one conflates experience, condenses it into a form, as one takes the intelligence of language and gives it a shapedness, that language acquires the energy of the yogi. Those forms of feeling acquire the intensity of the yogic concentration. They then have resonances. They have tapas also. So that one could bring the entire effective scope of the horizon of a complete language into a single word. Om. And that word acts as a pivot. Its calibration any place on the axis of rotation, on the axis of radiation. Two different qualities, generating space or generating time, related together, connected together, parallel together, so that space-time generates as a fabric. One can choose at which plane, on which double axis to make a cut of effective action. And so instead of just a blind activity occurring again and again, one modifies, one selects out, one chooses, one becomes, the phrase in one great Mahayana sutra was, one becomes a diamond cutter, a jewel cutter, Vajra Chadika. One learns that this is the structure of the real. This is how nature works, and one can cut along the structural line of nature. The famous Taoist story in Chuangzi about the Taoist butcher who, with his knife, is able to cut up an ox in no time at all, and the knife is just as sharp as ever. And the king wants to know, what is your secret? Why is this so? And the Taoist says, other butchers cut the meat, they hack at the bone, and of course their knives become dull with usage. I cut in between everything, in between the parts of the bone. My knife, not touching anything at all, of course remains as sharp as ever. It is this quality, the diamond cutter, the inner focus, the silence, the quietness. The quiet in the natural ecology only occurs in the mind. Everything else is active, except when the quiet of the mind becomes deep enough, one begins to notice that nature is a quiet action. Nature is consummate, quiet action, though it may be loud with sounds. It says nothing. Its language is mysteriously there, but unuttered. Nature does not utter a language. Existence speaks a language. Every existent thing has its language. Trees have their language. Minerals have their language. And a conscious differential person can learn that language, can speak the language, can speak the language of hydroxyl molecules so that one could make organic compounds. One could make anything one wishes. A scientific differential consciousness can make a laminate series of maybe 500 laminates, only one atom thick, as the specific and precise kind of film that one wants to use to coat such and such a thing, so that this platinum wire will be a receiving and sending antenna for a satellite even into interstellar space. This is a tremendous achievement of cutting nature like a jeweler, so that what comes out is no longer the universe, but a cosmos filled with the radiance of jeweled forms. It is totally different. And to such an individual, able to stride on cosmic fields, the shaman is an early phase. The yogi is an early phase. They're brilliant children. They're brilliant adolescents. But there's a lot more. There is as much more to reality beyond the shaman as the shaman envelops completely on his tiptoes at the very height of ecstasy. There's that much more yet available in the real. And so one asks a question, why does the taste of the times want to settle for sandboxes when there are interstellar realms without end? Eliade himself, we showed the two different photographs, the transformation. We showed the yogi and the scholar. The yogi who's already beyond the shaman, but the analytical scholar who went beyond the yogi. There's a kind of mysteriousness when the mind, in its depth, in its quiet, reverberates with nature. That nature is a mysterious process, is a quiet process, says nothing, does not have a mythology. In fact, in ekagrata, single-pointedness reduced even further. If one takes the Neolithic ekagrata and condenses it even further, what happens? What occurs? As Jackie Gleason used to demonstrate on the Honeymooners, something completely different opens up. Something completely unexpected occurs, actually occurs. The single-pointedness vanishes, and where it was, a focus remains that has no substance. Yet the focus works. It still continues to function. But it functions not only integrally, but now will function differentially. It refracts as well as reflects. So that the mirror quality of language, when we hold the process of language up to the world, up to nature, language mirrors nature, reflects nature. The extant forms in nature get reflected in language, and the reflections occur as images. The mistake is to think the images are in the mind. The images are in the language. The mythic images are not in the mind, they're in the language. If one is a yogi to point of ekagrata, that single-pointedness, called pranayama in Patanjali's yoga aphorisms, Patanjali's yoga aphorisms says that one can then apply pranayama to anything, and this is the knife that cuts. This is the diamond cutting tool that cuts. But one can go further than that. One can go into a motionless cutting, a quiet cutting, a quiet movement, an effortless movement. This manifests itself in a whole different realm, and when we get to symbols, we'll investigate this. But we need to bring it up now because Eliade, in his work, talks about the way in which a ritual comportment essentially ties itself with the gods who are there manifesting in existence, but they're visible not in things so much, but in the mythic images. The gods visible in the mythic images, and the ritual comportment that nourishes these mythic images, he talks about as the rituals of sacrifice. And how later on there's a quality of inner sacrifice. He writes here, the problem of the origins of yoga. In the case of yoga, which is primarily ascetic practice, the only orthodox value with which homologation would be possible was sacrifice. Homologation as a like extension. Correspondence on each point to each point, each shape to each point. This was possible on the one hand because sacrifice, like yoga on a different plane, was an act directed to, he uses the phrase here, the conquest of reality. Somewhat questionable. Let's use it for a temporary way. Yoga on a different plane, like the act of making a sacrifice, the ritual comportment of sacrifice. Yoga is an inner sacrifice. Ritual sacrifice uses nature. Yogic sacrifice uses language. Uses an inner pronunciation of language. Uses a quiet language. If one uses a spoken language, if one uses speech, if one tells the myth, there's no concentration that's available in the quietness. Yoga is a quiet language, condensation of language, deeper than what one can say. If one is speaking, if one is giving speech, speech actually connects itself to the act of speaking. When one tells the myth, the very telling of the myth is a speech act, is a ritual comportment. The saying of the speech, its physiological sound shaped into those words, that storytelling is a ritual comportment. It's a ritual action. Speaking has a karmic tone to it. Even though language is there in the mythic horizon, language is a part of the process of myth, saying it in a repetitive, formulaic way, in a ritual comportment, the act of saying it, the speech act, makes it ritual. So that Eliade writes here, on the other hand, because into the very economy of Vedic sacrifice a new element has been insinuated, the new element was ritual interiorization. Or, he gives the phrase here, the mystic exploration of certain gestures and acts which had previously been simple ritual gestures or concrete ritual acts. The yogic technique acquires franchise in Brahmanism by an interpretation proper to the mode of Vedic sacrifice. In other words, by regarding certain specific practices, for example, the discipline of respiration, of breathing, as ritual interiorization. The physiological breathing is for this body to breathe. It's a ritual comportment. The yogic indexing of the breathing into an evenness of breath, into a quaternary of breath and pause, is an interior sacrifice, an interior quality, related in a parallel to ritual comportment, just as objective, but on higher order, higher level. Just like later on, the spiritual person will be on a higher level than mind. So that when the spiritual person, when the differentially conscious person does something, is so powerful that it can index any number of minds whatsoever. No limitation at all. So that the objectivization of the person, which we'll get to in about a year's time in our education, becomes a truly astounding, astonishing, is an amazing quality. That persons do exist. Our person actually exists, but doesn't exist as a thing, like an extant. This is a very big reduction. does not even exist as a mental idea, which might be closer, but is not it. The spiritual person has an objectivity which is in the differential realm, belongs to the open universe, belongs to the cosmos. And here we come to the way in which Eliade phrases it in Myth and Reality. Under the subtitle here, What Knowing the Myth Means. And he talks here about Australian Aborigine and their totemic myths. Australian totemic myths usually consist in a rather monotonous narrative of the peregrinations, the movements again and again, the repetitive actions and movements by mythical ancestors or totemic animals, and that this happens in the dream time. What is that dream time? The dream time is in nature. In nature in its mysterious flow. That in that dream time, in that mysterious flow, these mythical ancestors, these totemic animals, these divine beings occur, but not in existence, but before existence happens. How do they occur then? They occur in a mystic participation with the process of nature. And because their very being is a mystic process in its happening, the shape of those particular mythic ancestors, those totemic animals, those divine beings are not discernible on level of action, on level of existence, on level of ritual comportment, but can only be discerned looking back in retrospect. They become discernible from the magic level of vision, from the seeds of differential consciousness at its very beginning, so that from magic one can look back and one sees a kind of a triple parallel. But one does not see with the objectivity of things, but one sees with the gestalts of affinity. The magic process looks through the language process, the mythic process, and discerns an affinity with the natural process. So that the inhabitants of the natural process touch and bridge the magical process and the being who, not so much who we are, but that we are. Not a who, but an ongoingness that occurs, our magical occurrence, which can precipitate into our spiritual person. But that magical presence in the process of vision has a parallel affinity to the way in which the language forms of the mythical ancestors, of the totemic animals, of the supernatural beings, of the way in which they bridge us to the real dream time, the nature, the natural mystery ecology, where these presences are there. So that one has two large fences that one must look over from vision, from magic. One must look over the fence that existence is between the mysteriousness of nature and the indelible accuracy of language. One has to look over the fence of existence, but one also has to look over the fence of the mind. The objectivizations in the mind get in the way. And so one has to look over the mind One has to look over existence. And looking in this way requires that we don't focus our eyes to see things, or we don't interiorize our focus to see inner things. If we continue to see the mythic image, we will not have affinity with the God who is there in the myth. We have to train ourselves. We have to discipline ourselves. And it takes repetitions. It takes a whole sealed, sacred solidarity with tradition to help us to learn to sense without focusing reductively on things, either exterior things or interior things, which are the images. So that the images which help us in one way also become barriers exactly one step later. And universal law. What helps us now will be a hindrance later, so we have to learn to hold it lightly, like the Taoist butcher with his knife. We don't want to cut against bone, we want to go in between. Like the jeweler, we don't want to fracture, but we want to facet. And making facets, then, requires a nimbleness, a participation. One would fracture if one insists upon the objective quality being the fact. One can only facet if one sees that process has its own occurrence. And though it cannot be called objective, it still has a substantive quality to it, generally called subjective. And yet we have to tread very lightly because the terms, the ideas, especially since Immanuel Kant, since the age of Goethe, one has to become sensitive that the subjective is not always polarized by the objective, that subject and object are polarities only in an objective phase, like ritual action, like mental thought. Subject and object are polarized in thought and in existence. But in language, they're not polarized at all. They're complementarities. And subject and object are not polarized in magic at all. Not in vision at all. There's no polarity there. There's complementarity. And so too in nature. But there are obscuring qualities that will occur. And myth is the first indication that these occur. Eliade writes, knowledge of the myths is essential for the life of the Australian Aborigines. You have to know the myths, or life is not possible as an Aborigine. If you're an Algonquin Indian from northern North America, you have to know the myths, or you're not a part of the people. If you're a tribe's member of the so-called gentle Tassidae in the Philippines, you have to know the mythology or you're not a member of the tribe. Why is this so? The myths teach them how to repeat the creative acts of the supernatural beings, and hence how to ensure the multiplication of such and such an animal or plant. Notice here that there is a quality to the Australian Aborigine mythology. It has a deep Paleolithic substrate, but it has a surface film of Neolithic quality on it. Yes, they are hunter-gatherers, but they're right on the cusp of becoming Neolithic. And on that cusp, on that thin film over the Paleolithic orientation of the Australian Aborigines, plants and animals will not occur in nature, qua nature, by itself, one must utter the songs in order to help it. One must know the myths, dance the dance. And it's not so much telling the myths as dancing the myths. One doesn't see a circle so much in a corroboree as one experiences a circle of dance. The rhythm, the pace of the movement is the way in which that language cadences itself. And in fact, the cadence of the dance carries itself over into seated myth-telling, so that the storytelling stick of the myth-teller is the cadence of the dance. But the purpose of telling a myth from a seated position is to transform the dance into an internal dance. The patience of the hearer is a patience of someone who is in a dance movement but within. One tells a myth to a population of people so they can dance within. It's already a very advanced, very developed situation. Originally, not primitively, but primordially, the myths would not be told without the dance. In the Blackfoot people of Alberta, it used to be that if a family got into economic difficulty with great sacrifice, they could sell the teepee, the mythological decoration on the teepee. But that mythological decoration on the teepee was encased in the myths about those symbols. They were only decorations if you didn't know the stories that went with them. But they sank deeper than decoration. They were no longer just painted images on the teepee. They deepened and they became mythological images, active in a double bifurcative way. They were active so that you knew how to dance them, and by dancing them, connect yourself with nature. Or you knew how to tell them in such a way that one could listen and connect oneself with magical capabilities of consciousness. So the language was midway. Myth is midway. Myth is a pivot. It's a pivot between the process of nature, which sustains existence, and the process of magic, which gives release from the mind. One of the most difficult qualities for us to appreciate, because we're completely crazy, we're mad, we're insane, we're legally insane, because we do not experience any kind of urgency not to be trapped in our minds, when the very essence of madness is to be trapped in your mind. If feeling lays the template for thought, the circles of mythology lay the foundation for circles in the mind. And if one does not know how to transcend from the circle of that mythology, one will stay there. While the circle of mythology is a process, the circle in the mind is a true limited and limiting form. A mythology, because it happens in a process, has its connection to action, which has its own governing quality. But that objective governor that stops excessive action, because it simply will result in death right away if you go too far in one direction. But in the mind, there's no governor like that. One becomes a living dead. One becomes a zombie very easy. One becomes an ideologue very easy. Because the circle of the mythology, while it's limiting, in a tribal, traditional, feeling-toned, experiential way. The circles of language give us the identity of the ego. But that same pattern carried over into the objectivity of the mind with the power of symbols becomes a doctrinaire, dead-end, box canyon, stifling thought form from which there is no escape unless one can transcend it. But the difficulty is that transcending it on the basis of powering out of it simply sends you from one thought form to another. It sends you from one prison to another. Or a regression sets in, and one goes back to a ritual comportment. One goes back to the body, which is why you see the gyms filled. The stylish gyms are filled with people whose bodies don't need training so much as they need freeing from their mind, from ideas that have become oppressive, from ideological indoctrination that they cannot believe, that they will not act upon, that they disbelieve, yet the indoctrination is there. They're true ideologues. They're fodder for any demagogue who knows how to manipulate that. And the release is a temporary release. It'll last one visit for the length of the visit. And when you leave, you're back. What did Buckaroo Banzai say? Be careful, because wherever you go, there you are. So there's no escape, there's no release from thought. And so to a primordial people whose lifeblood is in the health of a mythology, they are very cautious about thought. They see the world of the mind, the world of the interior, as fraught with peril. It's not something to go lightly into at all. Which is why traditional societies frown upon people getting educated outside of the viability of the circle, of the cycle, of the mythology, of the tradition. Which is why most versions and varieties of human life are tribal. They're cultural comfortability zones. And what is feared are ideas, because ideas are the most savage game of all. It's nothing to face down a mammoth, a cave bear, a python. They're nothing compared to the fierce, savage animals that ideas that are too large for one to handle become. Those vicious beasts can ravage hundreds of millions of people at a time. So, mythologically intelligent, feeling-toned men and women have very rightfully held a great suspect hand out to thinking. They're not thinking because they don't know how to think. They know very well, but they're also aware, as we are not aware, of the deep perils that are there. Bertrand Russell once wrote, "Man fears thought like the plague, because the thought becomes a wild card and will go where it wants to go unless you are very capable. If you do not know how to think, thought is devastating. Its energies are prolific. And so one finds in mythologies that the gods live in a very precarious kind of a realm for man. It's good that the gods live there, because that realm also contains the demons. And the gods can deal with the demons. But we can't deal with demons or gods. So part of the quality here for a mythologically intelligent people. I'm talking about high intelligence, deep maturity, men and women who are very smart about life, knowing about life. Eliade writes, reciting the origin myth compels, for instance, the rice to come up fine and vigorous and thick as it did when it appeared for the first time. Each telling of the myth makes the repetition of that time occur so that time is woven back into the traditional cycle of the people. So that instead of these angles and vectors of time, like arrows, which have a deep inside intensity, that if one surfs on them, one goes out of the culture completely. If you catch a vector of a time form, you can write it into the mind very quickly. It's deep water. It's big surf. Hanging 10 on the mind is very big kahuna. And so one of the qualities of mythology is to weave time back into the people, back in, so that one nests, so that time and even space are woven back into the traditional cycle, so that a mythic cycle becomes tradition, becomes a fabric of tradition, with a great intentionality, because men and women also have an inner quality then of their language. They put the intentionality to the language. Not just do the doing, but they tell the telling. So that there's this quality here of weaving in. The storyteller in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome has a quality. Excuse me a second. Not while it's going on. You can see the primitiveness of the modern age. There's no sensitivity when something is happening because of the ignorance of forms that one cannot see, even though people are gathered together here. But what was happening in the form was not even available. Even the simple wind of an old-fashioned demagogue blows people like that away. The technological demagogues of the next century are big wizards, and one needs to be founded on the whole axis of pivots available. And when men and women are founded there, it doesn't matter what happens. We will not only survive, we will thrive. We will nourish. And our descendants will be nourished. This quality of thought being precarious is something that we'll look at next week. And I think in connection with this, if you get a chance to read the section on word magic in Language and Myth by Ernst Cassirer, it was a very big concern of men and women to weave time back into the mythology. And yet, there are instances like this, intrusions that one cannot help, yet they occur. How do you weave them back in? You have to reach out to a higher process than myth in order to weave them in. And that higher process was magic. Magic is a higher process, wove in something even more powerful than time. It wove in eternity. And consciousness begins when the energies of eternity are folded into the energies of existence and the energies of the ideas. Once the body and the mind become vivified with energies of eternity, then the birth of the person is possible for the very first time. And that's what we're after, because that's who we are. Whether we recognize it or not, we all are that. We wouldn't be here if we weren't that already. But waking up to that takes a tremendous quality of recall, of remembering, yes, that's where we are. It's a curious quality, but you wouldn't be in this room unless you already were that. So the quality is not so much to struggle to make it happen as to remember that it is so. And for that, we need a couple more cycles of the education. Beyond that comes the final half year where one sees for the first time the real challenge, the challenge of navigating the ocean of history and of becoming at home in an actual cosmos, a conscious realm, as objective as any existence, but on a scale that dwarfs the conception of existence. More next week. Thanks.